There's a few names in horror that's definitely synonymous with the genre, and Frankenstein is no less, among those. We'll be talking about the 1931 original by Universal Pictures, and the 1957 by Hammer Films. I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds.
Hi there.
And I think this time around, the idea we've come across, multiple times now is man pushing the limits of science and stuff. So even though this is a horror movie, in some ways, it really feels like a sci-fi, because there's so much science to this particular monster and stuff.
Yeah, I think this was, the fact that this was written around a time when there was some quite interesting progress being made in the world of science. I think that's clearly what captured people's imaginations and really got them thinking about just how far you can really take this.
Yeah, and I guess as we get more into it, another interesting kind of aspect about Mary Shelley is that both of her parents are pretty radical. Her mother was pretty much like an early feminist and stuff, and the father really kind of talked about anarchy and kind of just what's called revolution, all that kind of stuff. And in some ways, I don't know. I guess as we dive more into it, we'll definitely have to see like kind of, what's part of the DNA of Frankenstein related to kind of, something that's kind of, being revolutionary or kind of counter to, I guess, the masses, I guess, and stuff.
Yeah, I think there's some very interesting and current themes in Frankenstein that maybe people haven't quite sort of picked up on, that we can delve into. But I think it's mostly down to sort of Mary Shelley's fairly unique upbringing and some of the events that happened to her during her life that shaped how this turned out.
What surprised me about the 1931 version is, like major spoiler, I actually didn't expect it to have a happy ending. I mean, I just kind of thought that, like, with a lot of these horror movies, it's usually something pretty tragic or, in fact, like kind of, it just seemed to be like that's where things are headed and stuff until it didn't and everything. And then, I mean, that's right off the bat caught me off guard.
Yeah, I mean, if it's actually, when you think about the ending, doesn't it actually end with the Baron, his father, sort of like having a drink in his son's honor, basically, more or less? It's like, yeah, that's not how I expected. I mean, it was certainly not many other Frankenstein movies end like that, that's for sure. So,
and the other thing was that, I kind of thought that he would be just as much as like kind of being chased by the villagers and stuff as the monster. So it surprised me that he was part of the party, kind of trying to hunt down, the monster stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, that was something I didn't realize as well. You often picture Victor Frankenstein as a kind of an isolated, reclusive character, whereas in the 1931, he's pretty much he's an integral part of the village. Yeah, and it's almost, the village are almost sort of helping him in a way, sort of trying to get rid of his monster.
Well, I guess, like kind of the fact that the father was kind of throwing this major party for, like everybody, like all the who's who of the village, I guess, and stuff on the eve of the wedding and stuff like that, probably, put him all in good spirits. So it's just kind of dampened things a bit when the monster, kind of killed the child and stuff like that. But other than that, I guess, like kind of the Frankenstein name in this case kind of was somewhat considered in good terms.
Yeah. So I guess we should sort of say, because that brings me back to this time period, of course, this is a pre-code movie.
Yes.
So not all of the standards are in place, and it kind of shows. I mean, one of the most shocking scenes, I would say, in this is the scene where Frankenstein, goes up to the little girl Maria by the riverbank.
Yeah.
And this, of course, is changed in the book, because in the original book, when Frankenstein escapes, he basically, I think he sort of pulls the girl out of the water, and the father thinks that, he's trying to drown her and shoots Frankenstein. And it's at that point where he kind of, thinks, screw these humans, and, rebels against it. Whereas in this, it's a pretty shocking scene in that Frankenstein basically just picks this girl up and throws her in the water, which is almost comedic in today's sort of light of things. But
Right.
it's then followed by this scene of the father carrying this child, this dead kid, through the village, and everyone's
Right.
celebrating for the Frankenstein's wedding.
Right.
And that's actually quite a shocking scene. I was like quite taken aback, and you can see that probably would not have, I mean, that's not even in the 1957 remake of it, let alone movies that came after it, even in the same decade later on, after they, you know, brought in the more restrictive film guides and stuff.
Yeah, we talked about that in Assault on Precinct 13, that it's always shocking to see a child getting killed, you know, on screen, you know, like kind of, even if it's not like, you know, gory and stuff like that. It's something that, like, I you know, like, out of all the taboos and stuff, it's probably like one of the ones that still remains pretty much up there.
Yeah, and it's the scene that really sort of jumped out at me in this one. I think as well, for me, this was actually a very kind of compact movie, and the pacing was actually very good. It moved along at a good click. It's very dramatic. Actually, the cinematography, for its simplicity, is really good. I mean, you've got Boris Karloff, obviously, as Frankenstein's monster. Most of the rest of the cast, maybe they were famous at the time, but probably Boris Karloff was the only one you really sort of recognize these days.
Right.
But yeah, so it's fairly close to the book in some respects. I would say that's probably the biggest departure, that scene, because it really solidifies your that he is a bad guy, he's a monster, and you're not supposed to be rooting for him.
Yeah.
And of course, in the book, Frankenstein is a much more sympathetic character. He has more, he can actually talk, and he has dialogue, and sort of tries to sort of make sense of his existence, where he doesn't really do any talking in 1931.
No. Yeah, I think that's something that became more trademark for the on-screen Frankenstein. You know, like, kind of, we'll see that, of course, in 57, that, like, he just generally is made to be pretty unintelligible and stuff.
Yeah. And so, I mean, in this one, I think, though, it does capture one of the more interesting parts of the whole story of Frankenstein, in that you have Victor preparing for his wedding, but he's completely sidetracked by his project to reincarnate life. And so we have, you know, it starts with him robbing graves with his assistant Fritz, who's kind of like the stereotypical kind of Igor character.
Right.
But there's this, what's I think is one of the more interesting things about the original story, is this idea of a man trying to create life in the absence of a woman. So it's this kind of interesting play on gender, and this is probably due to Mary Shelley and her upbringing, in that, you know, a man basically trying to, his scientific hubris getting to the point where he can completely contravene the laws of nature, where he can create life without even needing a woman anymore.
Right.
I'm sure that's a very strong sort of part of her motivation for writing this. I mean, I'm sure she was surrounded probably by very high-minded scientific men who are all trying to, you know, achieve various things, and probably women didn't get much of a look in 1808, I'm pretty certain. So I think this obviously resonated with her, this idea of hubris and going against nature, which is, I think, one of the key themes of Frankenstein.
Yeah, it's an interesting commentary about the idea that, like, oh, you know, kind of, you know, men having this idea that, well, you know, we're so powerful that we don't even need women at all. Like, you know, because right now, what do we need women for? Just to make babies, right? So, and so, you know, let's get to the point where, you know, we conquer science so much that we don't even need women for, you know, kind of making, you know, new life and stuff.
Yeah. And I think if we go to the general roots of the story, this is around about the time, you know, when electricity had been discovered, and you had Volta, who discovered the battery, and his, I want to say, cousin or relative Aldini had discovered that by putting electrodes on muscles of frogs, he'd managed to make them sort of shift around. So this idea that electricity was fundamental to somehow the working of the body was obviously a fairly, you know, contemporary idea, or the mystery surrounding that. And of course, we're coming from a more animal magnetism style understanding of spirituality. So, early development of electromagnetism and animal magnetism, it doesn't take too much to think, okay, maybe this is actually what generates life itself. Hence why we get it as such a prominent theme in the experiments of Victor Frankenstein.
And we see, like you mentioned about, basically it starts off with the hang, and it's actually a ceremony for the death where we see a lot of religious kind of ceremony around it and stuff like that, and it's almost this idea that like death is something natural and part of God's plan and stuff, and then this to bring back something to life and stuff is unnatural, and it's like kind of we're trying to have man's will conquer God's plan and stuff. It's kind of like this science versus religion in a battleground, I guess, it's of life versus death and stuff.
Yeah, and absolutely. I mean, there's a line I think where he says, when he does have the famous "it's alive scene," shortly after that he says, now I know what it feels like to be a god. That's pretty explicit there.
Right.
But I think what's funny is that it actually kind of contradicts itself fairly early on, because he, when they're actually getting the hanged body, he says, this is no good, the brain is dead.
Mm-hmm.
And then Fritz goes and breaks into a student, at a university, and steals a brain in a jar. And of course, that's where we get this
abnormal brain. And it's funny, I that's another reason why I feel like I want to kind of talk about Young Frankenstein stuff, because the joke in that movie is like kind of that Igor, which like that's another funny thing, is that he's actually called Igor in Young Frankenstein, and he gets confused and sees like the jar of like abnormal brain, so he goes, "It's Abby normal." Something. That's the joke.
Yeah. But so I mean, it's kind of interesting in that in 1931, did they actually know that once brain death occurs, or how long that occurs after death? Because that was a totally sort of didn't make any sense. But also this idea that you've got an abnormal and a degenerative brain, the brain of a criminal.
Yes.
So this is like this idea that immoral behavior is a physical trait that from the brain, really. That's where the dysfunction comes from, which of course then leads into this idea of free will, which I think is another theme in this, in that, are we a product of our genetics, or should we be blamed for our actions? Just like and this is a much more prominent theme in the book rather than the movie, but should Frankenstein be blamed for his violent actions, considering he's kind of stitched together out of bits and pieces and wasn't possibly trained as best as he could be?
Right. Well, the time period too, being 1931, this is a precursor to the ideas of kind of Nazi Germany, right, where genetics then is not only like you're saying about your destiny in some ways, but it's also like kind of this thing of where superior versus inferior kind of being and stuff like that are kind of manifested in their brain and their kind of physiology and stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, just as the abnormality of Frankenstein, should he be blamed for his sort of immoral actions? Likewise, on the same token, you can look at Victor Frankenstein in the same sort of frame and say that he comes from a nice sort of elite upbringing, and he's given everything that he wants, and his overuse of free will is a problem in that it's created this monster. So it's very clever in the way that it deals with that from both angles.
It's in fact the lab that you were talking about where the brain is stolen from. is with this Dr. Waldman, played by Edward Van Sloan, who coincidentally was also in Dracula and the Mummy and stuff.
Right.
And he asked him, Waldman, or rather, Frankenstein asks, Waldman, have you ever wanted to do something dangerous? So it's like kind of,
Yeah.
along with, like kind of just this hubris, I guess, and stuff. It's also like kind of this willingness and desire to kind of, like kind of go right up against, kind of what is, like kind of acceptable, or kind of like, because he kind of criticizes Waldman for, kind of playing too much within the lines and stuff, and like, oh, you can't see like kind of the possibilities and stuff, because you're always kind of following what's expected, or the norm and stuff, and in essence, like kind of that being kind of this idea again of what's accepted, or what's kind of acceptable, is staying within God's plan and stuff, or for that matter, what's kind of told to be God's plan.
Yeah, or just any sort of ethical framework, really. That's the sort of, I think, what they're trying to get across there. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, it highlights this idea that, if you're obsessed with a particular project and you start to lose, that the drive for success is more important than the ethical framework or boundaries in which you're working, is a dangerous, almost psychopathic kind of tendency.
That's definitely where I was going too, was because it's you and I have talked before about the idea that the highest percentage of what's called in CEOs and stuff, like in these leaders, right, are kind of considered psychopaths and stuff.
Yeah. And it actually really reminded me, it's funny because we did The Invisible Man recently, and one of the movies we looked at there as a remake was Hollow Man. Yes. And actually, the more I think about Hollow Man, I actually think it's got more in common with Frankenstein, I think, than it does with The Invisible Man, because the only difference being that he kind of makes himself into Frankenstein.
Right.
It's a much more sort of similar story in that he's kind of abandoned his girlfriend to pursue his career, and it's when and that's when he kind of creates this monster.
Yeah.
And I would say, and that sort of, that brings me on to actually like one of the other bigger themes, which I think comes from the book and is somewhat sort of alluded to in this, but isn't that obvious. But this idea of parenthood, because one of the things in this that I think Mary Shelley wanted to get across was this idea of abandoning your child, because she was a motherless child essentially,
right?
And I think also she had it was like a premature birth. I think her first daughter died about 2 weeks after she was born.
Yeah,
and she actually had a dream of this child coming back to life, which is pretty bizarre. But I think obviously this is all wrapped up in this idea of sort of abandonment of children.
Yeah.
And so, in this, what you see happen is that Victor Frankenstein abandons his wife and the normal process of creating life to go and do it by himself through sort of scientific hubris. And then he decides, oh dear, I've made a bit of a mistake. I'll abandon this monster and I'll go back to my wife and try and live a life of normality afterwards. But in doing so, he doesn't sort of teach this monster anything, and is just let loose, and it can't understand its own violent sort of tendencies. So I think the point she's trying to get across is that, by abandoning children to some degree, you create monsters essentially.
Right. Yeah, and that's along with lines of like we're talking about genetics and stuff, and nature being kind of driving force. Then it kind of reinforces that like other times it's also nurture as being the other kind of counterbalance, or in this case like kind of when you have almost like a double whammy, then like kind of it's like on the one hand he's got an abnormal brain and stuff, but the other, like you said, he's been abandoned. He's like, shunned right away and stuff like that by the other people, stuff like that. And, it's also this idea that like, if you right away rejected child, or like kind of just only show kind of hate towards something, then it's kind of almost expected that then it's going to just have a backlash, and how can you expect kind of a child, right, to have to be any better, or kind of want to be a better child or something like that, if right away you shun it, and then you kind of start abusing it right away and stuff.
Which is exactly what Fritz does. We see Fritz
Yes.
kind of tormenting the monster straight away,
Right.
and and obviously he gets his. That's almost a foreshadowing for the movie, for the story as a whole, in that he gets his comeuppance fairly quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, that also is in a way is this sort of going on this point of Fritz's deformity is obviously what he has mean. He's a social outcast or something like this, and takes it out on sort of Frankenstein. But it's quite an interesting part of this idea that society's perceptions of monsters as well, and how they mete out justice. Because just in the same way you could say that this abandonment creates the monster, she's also sort of saying this monster is socially unacceptable because the mob all comes around and ends up sort of hunting down Frankenstein. So it's sort of, again, it's reinforcing that, saying, you don't want to, if you want to create a socially acceptable person and not a ostracized monster, you better try and raise it properly.
That's definitely one of the tropes of the Frankenstein movies, is the kind of the villagers turning out into like this mob and stuff. I kind of expected even the one point where the monster finds his bride to be Elizabeth, to kind of carry her off and stuff, but that was kind of surprising that he didn't. He tried to and stuff, or at least he kind of snuck into the bedroom stuff. And I thought that was kind of, there was some irony, I guess, the fact that like she was trying to, I guess, kind of follow and help or whatever, something like that, and Frankenstein locks her in the room and stuff with the like unintentionally with the monster, like where because she locks the door, she can't get out and stuff, and so she's trapped in the room with the monsters.
Yeah. One of those sort of things where they just create a device to give people subvert their expectations. It's an early one of those, I guess, with movie making. Another thing I thought was interesting, because of course, as we mentioned in the book, he talks and he does a lot of sort of reasoning, the monster this is, and in the 1931, he doesn't really speak at all. So a lot of what you're trying to interpret is going on in Frankenstein's head can only be done through the way the scenes are constructed. And I thought this was done really interestingly with when he's first created and he's reaching out for the light, because they show him this window, so okay, he's ready to see some sunlight,
right?
And sort of Frankenstein's monster, I must stop making that mistake, reaches out to the light. And I thought this is a really interesting scene, because it's kind of this thing we always think of people with near-death experiences talking about going towards a tunnel of light and things like this, or the afterlife is often sort of portrayed as this very bright light sort of thing, and it's almost like you feel like he's trying to sort of reach back to what he knew. And then of course Fritz says, no, get back, and tells him. So I thought that was really interesting, in the way they did that. And there's often there's actually this dialogue where where Victor Frankenstein is talking to his professor, and he's saying, the way I've discovered this, how light is in a spectrum, I found there's something beyond ultraviolet light, which is the sort of light of creation and life. And that's what I've managed to sort of channel. And so there's a lot of sort of this echoing of forms of light in this. And there's very dramatic kind of single light cinematography all the way through in this, which creates very kind of dramatic shadows and shapes of Boris Karloff's face and things like this. So yeah, it's definitely a sort of theme that's reoccurring in it.
Yeah, the scene is really iconic. Like I think it's like even before I saw the movie, I was familiar with like kind of the lightning and the kind of everything kind of happening and stuff, and then of course like kind of the monster coming to life. And in fact, the movie Weird Science, they kind of like they
Yeah.
actually use the clip and stuff when they bring their fictional kind of model to life and stuff.
Yeah, so it's a kind of modern Bride of Frankenstein movie, I think, isn't it? Really, Weird Science. In that she's not entirely kind of socially acceptable either in her own kind of way. But yeah, yeah, I mean, it's I think the other interesting thing is this idea of that he's brought this monster back, but it has no recollection of its previous life.
Right.
And so there's this sort of message that it can't fundamentally operate. And I found this quite interesting because I happen to have watched a lot of near-death experience videos recently. And one of the most sort of common themes of that, or that you see, is that after someone's gone through that, they often go through depression because they find this inability, whatever they've experienced, I don't know, or to say, you can leave it, I'll leave it up to the viewers to decide whether it's real or not, or a function of the brain or something else. But whatever it is, it's clearly better than normal life because they come back and they often sort of think, oh, I wish I could be back there, and leads a lot of them into depression, and means they can't actually kind of functionally operate in society immediately afterwards, which is very similar to what you see in this, really. Like Frankenstein really has a problem. He simply can't sort of, he doesn't remember the moral sort of boundaries of anything or the social norms or anything. He's sort of completely adrift. So there's this sort of, you can't help feeling a sense of sympathy for him because there's a sort of certain hopelessness to his character.
Yeah, I think that's another interesting aspect of all this, is that different times, even though he's kind of this monster, we do feel a lot of sympathy for him. We like kind of, there's something about like kind of this like you've kind of pointed out how he's a child that's abandoned, and then he's kind of rebuked by kind of the villagers and shunned and stuff. And I guess it's kind of like different times we all kind of feel like kind of this alienation, and like we can identify with something that's so alienated and stuff.
Yeah, I thought it's one of those ones where it's this obviously tries to portray more of a monster than someone you should really overtly feel sympathy for, but I think that really sort of is credit to Boris Karloff for bringing out enough humanity in the character that you do feel some sort of sympathy for him.
Right. Yeah, I think it's just that kind of very minimal acting that he does that kind of does it, where it's he makes the monster very believable as something that like is almost like an unformed brain that like like it's on the one hand childlike, and we see that kind of in the scenes with Maria and stuff, and then the other it's kind of like just kind of almost like an innocence.
Yeah. It's funny, it's one of those things where you think it's quite an easy sort of thing to portray until you see other actors doing it and not doing it as well as Boris Karloff. I think that's I also thought the last scene, the climactic scene where there's the burning windmill, and that's the place where sort of Frankenstein dies. Obviously totally different from the book. The book ends up with them in the North Pole. And but I thought this was a really interesting visual sort of metaphor, because a windmill is a technological invention of that is actually in harmony with nature. When the wind blows, it does its purpose, and it needs no external power or electricity or anything else. And you've got this sort of windmill on fire, indicating we've gone beyond, nature has rebelled against us and sort of burnt this monster to the ground. it was an interesting. I don't know. I'm guessing that's what they kind of meant in that scene, but.
Yeah, and I guess in a way, the windmill is like something that kind of harnesses nature. It's like kind of man mastering, the forces, of nature for kind of achieving more, like because it's usually like made for grinding what's called grain and kind of into flour or it's something like that, where it's something that would be backbreaking work for individual people to achieve.
Yeah, I'm guessing raising the dead is probably equally difficult and backbreaking when we do finally get to it. Who knows? But yeah, any more final thoughts on the 1931 or?
I think that pretty much covers the major things and stuff like that. Probably the only other thing I'm trying to think of worth mentioning is probably the I thought it was like interesting how they kind of play up a little bit more of the marriage idea, like kind of where there's almost like a love triangle going on between his fiancée, Elizabeth, and then this guy who actually the guy the other kind of suitor, if you will, is actually called Victor. In this one, they actually changed it for some reason to Henry Frankenstein.
That was weird, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Apologies, I've been referring to him as Victor Frankenstein because that's but they for some reason they change Victor to Henry, and Victor is the friend, and I assume, I don't know if Fritz, if Igor is actually Igor in the original story. Oh, he's something else, is he?
Yeah, there's never really a mention of Igor until I don't know. I don't know even when they start using Igor, other than Young Frankenstein.
Maybe the 1931 movie. Okay. Right. Yeah, Elizabeth is always Elizabeth, though, I thought, in both the book and the movie, though, which is kind of, it's weird how they kept that name but changed the others. But anyway, So but yeah, a very kind of, actually a very good watch, not overly long, and does a really succinct job of telling the story in a very effective and still very sort of visually interesting way, I would say, and still, a lot of iconic scenes still have a lot of power today. So I guess then we move on to the Hammer Horror, 1957, The Curse of Frankenstein.
So this one is directed by Terence Fisher, who actually did, Dracula and the Mummy as well. And so, this is like the first movie actually with Peter Cushing and, Christopher Lee together.
A few interesting things about this. Christopher Lee was actually a spy in the military before he became an actor. And Peter Cushing, apparently, when he was younger, his mother used to punish him by pretending she was dead. So that may have a lot of reason for why he ended up in this sort of line of work. And apparently he never picked a movie based on whether he wanted to act in it. He picked a movie based on whether he thought his audience would enjoy watching him in that role, which is a very interesting way of looking at how to pick parts. But yeah. So I guess the differences here are, well, in this one, I think we've got a much more kind of spoilt and kind of super intelligent Victor Frankenstein.
Yeah.
And he's very much from a sort of a wealthy family. He's kind of dictating his own life. There are no parents around.
Nope.
And it's just him sort of basically running his own life and even picking his teachers. So we've expanded this kind of idea of free will and hubris to the point of, science is like a spoiled child just sort of playing with its toys, essentially.
Yeah, that's apparently like the origin of his pretty amoral path and stuff. I mean, in this one, it struck me was that he's kind of dabbling with the French maid while basically he's in this arranged marriage that he's apparently just kind of treating it as like very much like, yeah, sure, I'll marry her and stuff. And
arranged by himself. Which is the weirdest thing, is that he knows that the society requires him to marry someone of a certain standing, so he chooses his cousin in this, basically. but then whilst at the same time is kind of sleeping with his maid. I think it kind of reinforces this idea of someone who's just doing whatever the hell they want and doesn't really care what other people think, essentially.
Right.
And I think what's in some ways it's quite a slow movie, this, but it does mark quite an interesting progression of Victor Frankenstein, and you see this kind of, he's obsessed with science, and then he's all of a sudden collecting body parts, and he says to I've forgotten to mention Paul Crimper. So this is interesting in that we don't have any kind of Igor style assistant character in this. We have his tutor, who is older than him, who he picks himself as being the cleverest man around, and decides to choose him to teach him science. So we see this relationship develop between Paul Crimper and Victor Frankenstein, and this is this kind of dueling egos that pretty much makes up the first hour of the movie. And we see essentially Victor going down a more and more kind of psychopathic thinking path, where he's like collecting body parts and thinks, if we can just sort of stitch these together, we'll reanimate a dog, that's great. And Paul's like, okay, this is a great job we've done here, let's just leave it here, we'll go and report it to the scientific community and we'll just call it a day. He's like, no, I must go further, as you'd expect from a Hammer horror movie.
That definitely seemed to be their trademark, because we saw that with the Dracula movie, we saw that with the Mummy movie, where like this, like the first hour is pretty much like this kind of build up, and then then everything kind of like spirals, and kind of like we have this kind of climatic finish and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously it's a sort of way they must have contained the budget, and this is obviously a very sort of low budget picture, in that most of the action is for the first hour is conversation in Victor Frankenstein's lab, and very little else really. So it's, but I mean, it's quite good in the way that you see these kind of these questions of morality, of what they're doing, and how Victor manipulates people into furthering his goal, and that he basically keeps Paul around to help him with the science, but then sort of gives him a hard time whenever he tries to challenge him on anything. So it's,
and I think one of the ways they kind of play up how much of a psychopath he is like after he kills off the French maid Justine and stuff, he's like across the breakfast table, would you pass the marmalade?
Pass the marmalade. Yeah, it cuts immediately to him just it shows a complete sort of lack of empathy for the maid. So and that's that's a great performance by Peter Cushing in that role, really. It's because I guess you follow his path of his development from a kid, learning about this and becoming an expert. You do feel some sort of connection to him, and then you also sort of like, just like Paul does, you lose empathy for him as the movie goes on, as he becomes more and more removed from normality.
And that's very much a science fiction theme of like where, you can accumulate, and I'm trying to remember, I think there might have been even a quote by in the first movie with, Waldman, where this idea that, you can accumulate all this knowledge and stuff, but, if you don't develop any kind of wisdom / morality and stuff, then it's just, it only takes you so far. In this case, what we see instead is that like, it takes you too far, like where, Frankenstein just basically, gets to the point, like you said, that, anything kind of is doable, because like, next thing you know, he invites this brilliant, kind of professor or stuff like that to his house to be a guest, and then kills him off to use the brain for the creature and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, it's and there's this. I think that's what's sort of quite clever about this, is that they take the horrifying parts, which I suppose they might have been in 1957, are sort of dealt with they spend quite a long time on them, and the movie focuses in on those, in that there's a quite long scene where he's decided that the body of this sort of criminal, or that he's taken for Frankenstein's body, he said, well, I don't need the head, I need someone more intelligent. So they spend quite a long time with Peter Cushing cutting the head off, then taking it through and dissolving it in acid. So we're really starting to see this kind of the fact that horror will kind of dwell on these sort of the nastier parts of science, and isn't afraid to sort of show that kind of stuff. It spends a lot more time on that, and eyes being pecked out and things like this than the original, which is really the only gore, I would say, in this movie. It's just that sort of scene.
But at the same time, it's quite shocking for the time. I mean, up to then, we haven't really seen as much horror that's in color, and so like it's almost like with the advent of color film, then horror kind of like starts kind of reaching this golden age and stuff, because of the fact like now blood is red, and it's like definitely is more dramatic than stuff. And
I suppose we can't go on without sort of mentioning that Christopher Lee, this must have been one of his first Hammer roles as a monster. So he's actually the Frankenstein monster in this one. He doesn't have any speaking lines that I remember anyway. You're not really given any opportunity to feel sorry for him. There's no scene with him sort of trying to reconcile his existence. He's basically an unthinking killing machine. I think the message here being more that someone's obsession with the science and technology taken too far, it just becomes a weapon that not only is dangerous to other people, but he can't control himself either. And also we kind of see Frankenstein is a kind of a zombie in this one, in that it gets brought back to life at least once, maybe multiple times. I can't remember actually.
So after the first time that he's brought to life, the Paul like kind of Krempy shoots him and stuff, and at first like kind of Frankenstein kind of seems to be kind of like this kind of it's understandable that that you had to be destroyed and stuff like that. But on the other hand, it's like kind of like but I got to bring him back and everything. And so sure enough, like you said, they bring him back again. And I guess I can't think of any other ones where we really see that like Frankenstein is killed and then brought back and stuff. And and of course then the second time then like he goes at, where is it? So it's the second time that actually he then basically is like kind of this almost like childlike creature that's kind of tamer, and then and at that point that's like when Elizabeth sees kind of like when I guess Frankenstein and Krempy have this argument and stuff like that, and then she kind of sneaks into the lab, and then there's this kind of dramatic scene on the roof and stuff.
Again, I mean, this is kind of actually more reiterating the free will argument in this, and that again, we see Victor Frankenstein as this kid with complete control over his how he's raised, the money, has his own scientific experiments, and really his way of dealing with the initial problems of Frankenstein's monster is to just take away its free will, and so that it just sort of does his commands, and that's his way of solving the problem. It's like making stuff less and less human is his way of solving the problem, essentially.
But meanwhile, he's like kind of he wanted to put like the best mind in there, like with the professor, stuff like that, and then like the end result though is like kind of this creature that is as Krempy points out, like this is your brilliant mind that because like he's barely intelligible, and then is unable to speak, and you know, like, and really what he's doing is just kind of like, you know, like an animal kind of saying, you know, sit, you know, kind of like a dog or something like that.
Yeah. And then of course leads to the scene where he, the maid who's sort of being scorned, where he sort of laughs at her for you know, for suggesting that he marry her.
Right.
Gets her own back and finds out what's going on in the lab, and he basically commands it to kill her, which becomes more interesting at the end of the movie, where we see him in prison. And again, we get this idea of accountability for your actions and free will, and that the argument he tries to make is that the monster did it by himself, whereas sort of Paul knows that he had to command it. So really, you know, this is all Victor's free will that you know, caused the death of the maid, and just makes him basically, or just not that they make that an argument, they basically just deny the existence of the monster altogether, just to, you know, make sure Victor gets his comeuppance, which is probably well deserved, I would say.
Ironically, though, and I think that's almost like a trope of, you know, not just necessarily, you know, horror movies and stuff, but it's like kind of just, you know, like we see this across the board with villains, where to the bitter end, he's blaming, you know, Paul for, you know, he's saying like, hey, you damaged the brain. Hey, you shot it and brought, you know, made me kind of, you know, brought it to life. So it's like kind of, you know, the lack of accountability gets to the point where, you know, the villain will, you know, kind of excuse his own action and always put the blame onto somebody else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess we also have a kind of a love triangle a little bit in this, and that sort of Paul and Elizabeth are, you know, you get the feeling there's something going on there. I mean, one of my favorite scenes in that was where I can't remember what it is. Elizabeth is somewhat angry, or no, Paul is telling her to leave when she first arrives, and is going to try and sort of marry Victor. And he's there. It's very kind of over the top English affected accents going on, whereas they're going, "You must leave," and she's like, "No, but I'm here." No, you must leave immediately and not come back. And all this thing is there. It's quite good in that respect. It's very, very sort of wooden, proper English sort of anger there.
Right. And then they end up kind of apologizing to each other.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, they get, I'm terribly sorry for my outburst, and yeah, well, that sort of thing. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, given that it's a little bit slow, and most of the action really only takes place in 2 rooms and with the roof and a little bit outside. There's kind of 4 sets more or less, but it's a pretty decent movie, all things considered. I did prefer the 1931 though. I thought this was, I think it just has more, there's just more sort of visual depth, I think, in terms of the way it portrays Frankenstein as well. The monster, that is, sorry.
I think, this one is kind of just more groundbreaking for, you know, kind of the use of color, and also just a very minimalist kind of, you know, like kind of like you said, just a few, you know, scenes, a few locations and stuff. They achieve a lot. Like kind of, I think, you know, like that's really what it. I mean, I think that's, you know, kind of one of the trademarks of the Hammer films, is that they, you know, tell a lot through very, you know, through their low budget. I mean, they really just, you know, kind of, it's almost like kind of, that's their magic, is like how they take, you know, very few dollars and kind of, you know, turn it into so much more and stuff.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, you've got quite a lot of interesting kind of dialogue between Victor and Paul in that. And this, as I say, it's this kind of dueling egos and outlooks on life that really carries that first hour. And the slightly estranged Elizabeth in the background, but they're the main kind of central focus of it.
And I think, you know, like the other thing pointing out was that whereas other kind of you know, studios were really hesitant to, you know, get what I guess is called an X certificate back then, which is kind of like an X rating, you know, here in the States, but Hammer Films just started kind of embracing it. You know, like kind of they had the other what's called X the Unknown, and kind of just other films where they basically like not only just took on the certificate and stuff, but they just kind of really embraced it, and that became their trademark to kind of make something more racy, I guess, and stuff.
Yeah, the early sort of marketing cleverness there, knowing that bad publicity is also sort of good publicity too, so to speak, and if there's people talking about it, that's probably a good thing. I mean, it's ridiculous to think these were so sort of violent and horrible that they couldn't be shown. I mean, my daughter, who's 7, has probably watched most of these Hammer movies with me. And I think apart from maybe Dracula, where there was a sort of a bloody scene, she's quite happily sit through most of it. And nothing is even, probably Harry Potter is scarier and more violent than these original Hammer horror movies, really.
Yeah, just another interesting aspect of all this is kind of just how times change and stuff. I think both versions though really touch on the kind of the subtitle, I guess, if you will, of the Mary Shelley novel, of kind of calling it the modern Prometheus, and this idea that it's kind of somebody's stealing kind of the power of the gods, kind of for mankind and stuff. And that's in itself a really interesting idea of science in general.
Yeah, and it was actually that, of course, got me thinking about Alien, Covenant, and Prometheus. Because I thought, oh yeah, actually, when you look at it through the lens of Frankenstein, it's kind of like a meta reference to Frankenstein, and that, David is like the technological Frankenstein that we've created, and his own ambition is what creates the aliens. It's kind of like a Frankenstein within a Frankenstein movie, in a way. Very unsatisfying, as of course most people have realized, but yeah, I think there's definitely a lot it has in common.
And I think that's the other interesting aspect, like we kind of touched on it a little bit, but different times when we say the name Frankenstein, we're usually referring to the monster, but really, the monster is, Victor. And for that matter, it's his ambition.
Yeah. The monster is a representation of his sort of ambition, taken with no sort of ethical framework, essentially, isn't it? Yeah. But I think the problem is, I think when going back to Alien Covenant, I think when that first, there was so much promise in Prometheus that we were going to see this amazing kind of engineering paradise planet where we'd learn all the secrets of, how they've created and seeded life across the universe. But then it just became, oh no, we're just going to kill everyone in the first like half an hour, and that's it. Then it's just a standard horror movie after that.
Yeah,
I think that was what was most. But I mean, if we'd gone into it knowing that we were watching a remake of Frankenstein, may not have been quite so disappointed with it, I suppose.
Bad marketing.
I know, right? Yeah. So I guess this is near that we've got next. We've got our 1994 and 2015 versions of Frankenstein to go through. Definitely. And then I think, is this the last of the Universal monsters? No, we've still got the Wolfman.
We still got Wolfman,
yeah, and then we will have done them.
Definitely. And as you and I talked about offline, look forward to kind of finally talk about Dune. It's turning out to be quite surprising in how good it is, and that definitely is very promising. In an age of many bad remakes, and
I know, right? Yeah, this is something we could genuinely feel excited about for us having to sit through it. So yeah,
cool. So once again, I'm John Chang, Dan Edmonds, and we'll see you at the movies.